So after 1731 or so, San Antonio starts to slowly grow and become more prosperous. And so for the women who were living in San Antonio during this time, they were able to go to a dry goods store and buy cloth, which was a vast step up from the earliest settlers. A few years later, they could buy ribbon and lace and decorate their dresses because these Spanish women liked to look good. They had lots of festivals, parties, fandangos, all sorts of fun events, and they wanted to look their best. So when they could actually get clothing that was somewhat in fashion, they were really happy. So the late 1700s in San Antonio were, for the most part, pretty good for people of the time, right? The houses got better. They found where there was some wood. They learned how to build with adobe, so the houses were a lot better. They dug wells, so they had well water. They had enough crops most years. Their livestock grew and grew, so they had plenty of meat to eat. And things were pretty good. There were still Indian raids, especially the Apaches would come in and steal livestock and so forth. So there was always kind of that threat. But for the most part, life in San Antonio was very much like life in Europe at the time. So the women settlers there, they were kind of happy. They were very nice to each other most of the time, although there were some temper tantrums. We do have court records, which is one thing I like to look at. And one thing you find out about the court records is these Spanish women had rights, and they knew their rights, and they were willing to go to court to protect those rights. Women in Spanish law could own land in their own name even if they were married, which was an amazing thing at the time. So they would go to court to fight for their own rights. So they were established. We'll use that word. By the 1700s, these Spanish women were living fairly well for being on the frontier. And then in the early 1800s, 1810 specifically, the Mexican Revolution started. And some of the fighting took place in Texas. And I don't know if you've heard of this guy, Santa Anna, but he learned while he was still a junior officer during the Mexican Revolution to take no prisoners. And as the fighting for the Mexican independence went on throughout Texas and the rest of Mexico, people were just killed and killed and killed. It was devastating to Texas. By the end of this, in 1821, there were only a few thousand Spanish people left in Texas. And these were settled in San Antonio was the big city. La Bahia was another mission town, Nacogdoches. The rest of Texas, again, was Indian country, controlled by the various Indian groups, and the Spanish lived in their little towns and didn't go outside of them very much. So, of course, that brings us to the Mexican era. And in Mexican Texas, San Antonio didn't change much. The women there lived pretty much the same as they had been. They spent a lot of the day making food. They had to grind the corn for their tortillas, so the first thing in the morning, the woman would get up and grind corn in her metate to make the tortillas. She spent a lot of time spinning and weaving and making clothing, looking after the livestock, taking care of the house, going to church, teaching her children their prayers, and so forth. So a very routine life, but with these parties every now and again, as I mentioned before. But it is during the Mexican era that the Anglos start coming in, mostly from the south. With Stephen F. Austin, again, you may have heard of him, with his 300 families. They came in almost en masse, just a very rapid migration pattern that these 300 families came in, and they had to pass inspection. They had to be respectable people. They had to have people vouch for their character. To live in Austin's colony. And so they settled, and there was the little town of San Felipe. If you've ever been on vacation, you can still go there. But then most people lived out on their own farms, right? So for women in Austin's colony, this was a very isolated existence. You lived on your farm and you saw your family and you didn't see anybody else, as opposed to the women in San Antonio who lived in town and saw their neighbors every day. Now, just the getting to San Felipe was difficult, treacherous. most people went to New Orleans. Now remember, they're coming from the American South. So they go to New Orleans, and they get on a ship in New Orleans with all their belongings, and they go to Galveston. And Galveston in the 1820s is not the Galveston of today. It was muddy, it was dinky, had yellow fever epidemics all the time. But it was the biggest city in Texas, and it was a port. So they would sail to Galveston. Many of the ships actually were lost at sea, so not everybody who came made it. But if they did make it, then they would take all of their goods off the ship, put them on wagons, and then go from the ship to a ferry, and then cross the ferry into what is now Houston, and take off in wagons to go to Austin's colony, which is sort of, okay, if this is Texas, okay, everybody Texas, kind of around in here, okay? So this was a trip that took several days, and it was, if you've ever ridden in a wagon, like a real wagon, it's bumpy. But once you got to Austin's colony, you paid very little for your land, and you got a lot of land. The Mexican government was giving very large pieces of land, and you set in, and you built your house, whether it was out of wood, if you were in a wooded area, or you built a sod house, or some people lived in tents for a while, some people lived in their wagons for a while they collected enough material to build. And the women's lives were, again, isolated, but doing things women have always done, right? You get up first, you make your breakfast for your family. For these women, that would include gathering eggs to make eggs, milking cows, letting the cream rise to the top so you could make butter out of the cream, washing clothes, which we think of washing clothes, you know, you dump them in the washer, but washing clothes for these women meant building a fire, a rather large fire, so you had to gather wood. So you built your fire, you had a tripod that had a big wash kettle on it, cast iron usually, a big heavy thing that you put on there first. And then you had to carry water from the stream to fill it up, and you'd light your fire after you put your water in it, because when you're bending over the fire, it's dangerous because these women were wearing long skirts. And just imagine in a day like today when the wind's blowing a little bit, if you're standing on the wrong side of the fire and the wind blows, your skirt catches fire and you burn. It was a very dangerous occupation, just washing the laundry. So laundry, you boiled your clothes to kill all the bugs, and you would wring it out, and you'd put a stick in there and sort of twist it around, and then you put it in the cold water to cool it off. You'd have the lye soap that you made yourself from beef tallow and wood ash, and you'd scrub on a scrub board, and then you'd swash it around in the cold water, and then you'd boil it again for a while, and then you'd hang it up on the nearest bush to dry. So people didn't have a lot of clothes, but it took a while to wash them because this was manual labor. And so you may have heard it's not really a poem, but wash on Monday, iron on Tuesday, mend on Wednesday, churn on Thursday, brew on Friday, and bathe on Saturday, go to church on Sunday. So every day they had their ordinary household chores they had to do, and then one day a week they had this other major chore to do. Churning was actually a favorite day for a lot of the women because not only could you sell butter and make some money, but you could sit down while you were doing it. Everything else you did standing up, but you could churn sitting down. And then they would also have seasonal things that they did, like if you found wax, some beeswax, you would make candles. And you do that by dipping. If you've ever seen anybody do the dipping candles, it takes a while, and people didn't use candles all that often. Mostly when it got dark, they went to sleep. But you had candles. If it was pig killing season, then you spent days and days and days slaughtering your hogs. They didn't really have too many cattle because they didn't have ways to preserve cattle yet. So they had pigs. It was easier to preserve the pigs. You could smoke them, get ham and bacon and so forth. So women worked. I mean, this was hard manual labor all day long, every day. Work. Women who were slaves worked harder. There were a lot of slaves in Texas in the Mexican era as well as later on. The Mexicans were kind of uncomfortable with this, and they kept passing laws to try to limit slavery. But the reason that these Anglos were coming from the American South to Texas was to raise cotton and get rich. And the way you did that was if you had slaves do most of the work. So slave women worked in the fields, worked in the house, worked everywhere. So they had a life that was even harder than the white women.